after the FDA authorized injecting this experimental vaccine into teenagers, some stuff started happening. But as this article will assure us, the CDC investigating all these heart problems in teenagers means nothing at all. So today, we're going to be looking at this article from the New York Times, and let's start out with, I think this is particularly relevant today, with the bias section on the 5 sheet. So we see here that they are corporate media, which means they are deeply entrenched with the pharmaceutical companies. If you're not already aware of this, the big pharma is the biggest sponsor of corporate media. These guys are largely reliant on advertisers, cable news, the newspapers. These guys rely on ads for a huge portion of their revenue. And who buys the most ads? It's the people selling boner pills. So they have this very deep incestuous relationship where the corporate media is reporting on these people while at the same time these people are paying their salaries. So if they go and write a negative piece about these people who are paying their salaries, maybe those people are going to go take their business to one of the other outlets which writes more favorable pieces. So there's a very, obvious conflict of interest there. You can find, this has been reported on by independent media sources. It's not just an apparent conflict of interest, it's an actual conflict of interest. There are interviews where people are saying, hey, I had this or that story, and it got quashed. Alright, so that's step one with the bias. The other part of it is that New York Times is, largely aligned with the mainstream element of the Democratic Party right now. And in line with that, they favor the narrative that big government is generally right. So whatever the CDC says, or whatever the FDA says, or, whatever the top most important federal agency says, that's the correct advice. Right? It's big government. That's sort of what defines... That's one of the main definitional features of the Democratic Party in 2021. Like, the wokeism is a newer thing, but New York Times is kind of getting into that, but they are more traditionally defined with the big government side of it. Alright, so the thesis, as I have it paraphrased here, which I think is an accurate paraphrase, as we'll see, the CDC's investigation of myocarditis, probably pronouncing that wrong, in teens 4 days after receiving mNRA vaccines is not something lay people should be concerned about. So remember that, thrombosis thing that got that other vaccine pulled? I think it was the Johnson & Johnson one. So keep your eye out for this the next week or two. This is probably going to be the new thrombosis. So this is the first thing we're seeing here, because the CDC already took action on this, announcing that they're doing these investigations because these little kids were not part of the trial. I mean, why on earth would have they been? They have essentially zero risk from COVID. So why would they be part of the trial for this experimental vaccine? Which is still not even approved it's still not approved even for adults, but it's now been authorized under the emergency use authorization for these teenagers. Because I guess COVID is still this crazy emergency. It's not like cases are going way down even before we started injecting all these little kids. So, believe it or not, all these people that were not part of the clinical trials, they're starting to show some reactions that we didn't see in the clinical trials. So maybe this is nothing, but maybe it is something. And the fact that the CDC is actually taking action on it, that leads you to believe that it's likely to be something. Because the CDC has been hesitant to actually do stuff. They've been in the vanguard of saying vaccine 10,000% safe and 100,000% effective. Don't think about it, just take a shot, wear 4 masks, you'll be fine. So the fact that they're saying, maybe we should actually do some investigation here, that is a strong signal that there actually is a there. We'll see. It's not definitive, but keep your eyes on this. So, let's keep going down here. So, this whole piece, there was a lot of manipulative stuff going on. Let's just start running through these one at a time. Strawman feigning ignorance, one of the most common go-tos, where they just mischaracterize arguments, omit relevant factual pieces of information. Alright, first one up, they had some doctor expert guy. This was the quote, or I think it might have been a lady, who cares? All that matters is the white lab coat, right? They had some individual with a white lab coat saying the following quote. It's more likely for something like that to happen by chance, because so many people are getting vaccinated right now. Referring to all these heart problems the teenagers are having. But the very next paragraph says, the cases seem to have occurred predominantly in adolescents and young adults about 4 days after their second dose of one of the mNRA vaccines. And these cases are more common in males than in females. Does that not strike you as an odd contradiction? Such a specific clustering of cases there? So, what does she say? It's more likely to happen by chance because there are so many getting vaccinated right now? Is it more likely that... So just because there's a ton of people getting vaccinated right now, that means that all these males, but not females, are having this thing by chance, and it always happens about 4 days after the second shot. Does that add up? It feels like they're feigning ignorance. They're omitting that part of the argument. They're not addressing that relevant detail. They're just letting this doctor lab coat person say that thing, and then they are obliged to state, because that part about the people who are having these effects, that came directly from the report from the CDC. So they were obliged to put that in there. But they just prefaced it with don't even worry about it. It's just going to happen because there's millions of doses. When you give out millions of doses, this certain very specific population will have heart problems. It's like, wait, what? What? How does that connect? So they don't address that. That is, it's a little fishy right there. Alright, let's see what's up next. So, this is later on in the article talking about some other doctor guy who said he had treated a teenager who later returned for care with a so the quote I had, the teenager he injected had some heart problem, and then quote, the teenager later returned for care with a decrease in the heart's output, meaning a more severe, at first the doctor hand waved it you just got an injection, your heart's a little fucked up, no big deal. But now the teenager received dude, the fucking thing's not beating right. And he's okay, this is actually a problem. I have to report this. Okay, fine. And the quote continues. Still, Dr. Yor said he had seen worse outcomes in youngsters with COVID, including a 9-year-old who had arrived at the hospital following a cardiac arrest last winter. Well, that disproves it, right? Some youngster had a cardiac arrest? Well, why? What about the possibility that that youngster, that cardiac arrest was coincidental? I mean, they bring that up every time it's mentioned that they give these teenagers an injection and then there's a heart problem. Like, oh no, but it's probably just coincidental. There's millions of vaccines. It's, kind of similar to the background, right? Don't worry about it. But in this case, there was just this one kid who he might have had COVID or something, and this kid came in with a heart condition. So what the what? Shit, man. Case closed. That's evidence that they're clearly pushing a certain narrative, right? They're putting much more weight on one side of the argument than they are on the other. They're shining more light on certain evidence than they are on other evidence. Alright, it continues. Next up was statistics lacking context. It's no secret that statistics are one of the most easily manipulatable pieces of data out there. Alright, so they had this quote. As of May 13th, the coronavirus has infected more than 3.9 million children and sent more than 16,000 to hospitals, more than are hospitalized for flu in an average year, according to data collected by AAP. About 300 children have died of COVID-19 in the United States, making it one of the top 10 causes of death in children since the pandemic began. So, what I want to know is, how is this data being collected? Well, first of all, I didn't have this noted down. With top 10 causes of death in children, what are the other causes of death in children? What's that curve look like? How many children die? What do they mean by children? Is that everyone under the age of 18? How are those categorized? Whatever, that top 10 seems like a weird cherry-picked number. But rather than get into that, let's look at the Pcr Cycle Count. Right, 3.9 million children. How many of them had actual cases of COVID? And how many of them had a brush of the SARS-CoV-2 virus against their skin that was cycled up 40 times in a PCR test and came back with a positive count? So, they changed the recommendations where even Fauci himself said, any PCR test cycled more than 35 times, that tells you nothing. That's useless data. It could, just about anything could come back positive. But most of these tests that we've been doing, there's not been a uniform standard, and many of the labs throughout the country have been doing in excess of 35, some in excess of 40 cycles. So I'm curious, of those 3.9 million children that were infected, what were the cycle counts on those? And the CDC has acknowledged this even more firmly recently when they put out new guidance on, okay, if you're just going to declare that someone's got a case of COVID, fine, use whatever cycle count you want. But, if you're going to say this guy has a breakthrough infection, if this guy's already been vaccinated, and then you're going to record it in the statistics, and say that he has COVID after being vaccinated, you can only do that with 28 cycles or less. What? So they changed the data collection method for post-vaccination breakthrough cases, and they're still able to record new cases of COVID if you haven't been vaccinated using 35-40 cycles. So, whatever. That 3.9 million children, I don't buy that those 3.9 million children have had actual cases of COVID-19. I think if you're in the same room of someone with SARS-CoV-2, and then you get a PCR test that cycled up 40 times, then it's going to come back positive. So that is what they did not address here. Alright, another statistic issue. Quote, more than 161 million people in the United States have received at least one dose of a coronavirus vaccine. About 4.5 million of them were between 12 and 14 years of age. Were between 12 and 18 years of age. So, two issues with that statistic. One, how many of them were between 12 and 16? Because that's the newly included group. Right? When they changed the recommendations a few weeks ago, it was that 16 to 18 people had been receiving injections the whole time. So it seems weird that they include that. And two, had received at least one dose of the coronavirus vaccine. They make it clear here that this problem arises 4 days after receiving your second dose. So why are they including this 4.5 million number? How many of those people received their second dose at least 4 days ago? That number is irrelevant to the story at hand. Why are they including it in the story? It's obviously for manipulative purposes. Why else would it be? There's no other reason it would be in there. Alright. Just one more little piece of manipulation these guys got. Alright, the last named manipulation piece here is the one side of the story where they have a number of experts here, a number of different quoted people, all explaining how, all agreeing with their narrative. They're like, yeah, the CDC said this, but what it really means is, don't worry about it. You little plebeians don't understand the science and stuff. You're fine. Just keep injecting those teenagers. Everything's gonna be A-okay. They don't have a single person on the other side of the argument. They don't have a single person arguing that maybe there is that this myocarditis thing, whatever that's called, that there's an actual, that it's uncommon in these groups, that this particular clustering is weird. Whatever an expert might argue. They don't have a single person arguing that side of the case. Every person they have arguing it is on one side of the narrative. So that's just something to note here, is that they're only showing you one side of the story. And I don't think that's something to be surprised about, because this feels like an obfuscation piece. It's really, they didn't address the elephant in the room. If there's no good reason to worry about teenagers developing this heart condition after taking the vaccine, then why did the CDC take this action? That is what the New York Times did not address in this article. So I was starting to think that the New York Times, reading any of their articles on pharmaceuticals is useless. But I don't know. I think it might not be useless, but just inefficient. Why can't we just cut out the middleman? I'm sure I can find press briefings somewhere on Pfizer's website.